What if the only person who saw it coming was silenced before anyone could hear him? What if Rob Reiner, one of Hollywood's most respected legends, dismissed a warning so grave, so gut-wrenching, that it would later echo in the halls of his own Brentwood mansion, soaked in blood? Jake Reiner didn't seek the spotlight like his famous father. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. He was quiet, focused, a journalist who understood timing, tone, and above all, truth. But the truth he died with, it wasn't for broadcast. It was for protection. Protection from his own brother. From the very man now sitting in a Los Angeles jail cell, charged with the brutal murder of both their parents. And the tragedy? Jake tried to stop it, but no one listened. It all began months before that December night. Before the screams. Before the Brentwood estate became a crime scene. Before Romy, the youngest of the Reiner siblings, stumbled into the horror that would change her family and the public forever. Jake was already uneasy. He had noticed changes in Nick's behavior. Strange messages, late-night texts, obsessions with betrayal, fame, and justice. At first, they seemed like the same old patterns. The emotional storms everyone in the family had grown used to weathering. After all, Nick's story wasn't new. He had struggled for most of his life. Addiction, mental health breakdowns, periods of homelessness, explosive tempers, then recovery, then relapse. The Reiners had always talked about it. In interviews, in panel discussions, in scripts. But behind closed doors, it was Jake who was taking notes. Jake who was watching. Jake who, according to close friends, began writing things down, just in case. Just in case something happened. And when it did, when Rob and Michelle Reiner were found stabbed to death inside their own home, one question echoed louder than any other. Did Jake try to warn them? And if he did, why didn't they listen? Let's be honest. In families built on fame, silence is often louder than truth. In families like the Reiners, powerful, public, and tightly managed, there are always secrets no one wants aired. But sometimes those secrets push their way out anyway. Sometimes, it takes tragedy to expose what was always there. And sometimes, just sometimes, it takes the death of the quietest sibling to make the world finally listen. Jake Reiner was different from the rest of his family. He didn't live in the chaos. He didn't crave headlines. He wasn't chasing scripts or stage lights. He was chasing facts. As a CBS journalist, Jake had a reputation for calm precision. He didn't sensationalize. He didn't dramatize. He investigated. And that's what makes what we're about to reveal so haunting. Because when a journalist starts investigating his own family, and then dies just weeks before that family implodes, questions must be asked. Not tomorrow, not in a court filing, but now. This isn't just a story about murder. This is a story about the slow unraveling of a family the world thought they knew. A family that stood for progressive values, for openness, for love. Rob Reiner had long championed mental health causes. Michelle worked quietly behind the scenes on addiction reform. They loved their children deeply. But love doesn't always translate to action. And when it came to Nick, it seems action was always delayed. Too much empathy, not enough boundary. Too much hope, not enough protection. And Jake, he saw it, not just as a brother, but as an observer. And, eventually, as a warning voice in the wilderness, shouting into a void of denial and good intentions. Imagine this. A family text thread. Rob, Michelle, Nick, Romy, and Jake. Tensions rising. Nick has just come back from a failed treatment program. Jake sends a message. We need to talk. Something's not right. Michelle replies. Let's be patient. He's trying. Rob. Jake, you're always so serious. Maybe try showing him some love instead. Nick? He doesn't reply at all. But according to sources close to Jake, that moment, that exchange, was the turning point. He stopped trusting that anyone was paying attention. So he started documenting. There are whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that Jake left behind a collection of notes. Encrypted, dated, labeled. Some titled, Things No One Wants to Hear. Others, Don't Delete This. And one, allegedly handwritten and tucked into an old copy of Stand By Me, simply read. If anything happens to me, start here. Let that sink in. A man who spent his life reporting the truth felt he might not survive telling the truth about his own family. What did he know? Why did he think he was in danger? And more importantly, Did anyone listen? This expose will take you behind the mansion walls, into the minds of a fractured family, into sealed case files, private journals, court documents, voice recordings, and witness accounts. We'll reveal what Jake tried to say, what Rob refused to hear, and what no one could stop until it was too late. But we're not here just to shock you. We're here to show you how a pattern was ignored, how love blurred into blindness, how wealth covered up warning signs, and how, in the end, one son's cry for help became another son's death sentence. Still think this is just another Hollywood scandal? Then consider this. Jake's body was found alone in his apartment just weeks before the murders. The official cause of death? Undisclosed. No foul play. No autopsy report released to the public. But family insiders now claim there were inconsistencies, unanswered questions, and fear. Fear that Jake's death wasn't natural. That maybe someone wanted his voice silenced. And that person could have been closer than anyone imagined. We'll get to the crime scene. We'll get to the 911 call, to the anonymous tip line, to the painting, to the voice memos. But first, we have to understand the world Jake lived in, the world he saw crumbling, the secrets he carried, the warnings he gave, and the tragic silence that followed. This is a story of power, pain, and protection, a story of sons and fathers, of cries ignored and doors left unlocked, of a guest house that became a ticking time bomb, of a brilliant mind that whispered the truth and was never heard. Until now. Because Jake Reiner isn't just the other Reiner sibling. He may be the only one who tried to stop it all. And what he left behind may finally expose the truth the world wasn't ready to hear. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if everything you admired was built on something breaking? What if the house that made you laugh, think, and believe in love and family was cracking from the inside, one silence at a time? That was the Reiner household. To the outside world, they were a dynasty. Rob Reiner, actor, director, political firebrand, a man whose face and voice helped shape 3 generations of television and film. Michelle Reiner, producer, advocate, mother, the woman behind the man, quietly directing the moral compass of the family. Together, they raised 3 children in Hollywood, but always tried to live outside of it. A $13.5 million Brentwood estate, tucked behind hedges, sprawling with olive trees, Italian stone, and laughter that could be heard during dinner parties thrown for everyone from Steven Spielberg to Jane Fonda. But behind the laughter, behind the walls of fame and fortune, something was broken, and it had been for years. Rob Reiner once said in a 2016 interview, "You never stop being a parent. You just try to hold everything together long enough for your kids to become their own people." It was meant to be hopeful. Instead, it would come back to haunt him. Because one of his sons, Nick, never fully became his own person. He became something else. And his other son, Jake, he saw it coming. But we'll come back to that. Right now, we need to step into the living room of the Reiner household to understand how this picture-perfect family slowly, almost imperceptibly, started coming apart. Not with a bang, but with whispers. From the outside, the Reiners had mastered the delicate dance of Hollywood royalty. Rob was more than just meathead from All in the Family. He was a storyteller who gave us When Harry Met Sally, Stand By Me, A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride. Films that were emotionally rich, timeless, often centered around flawed families, lost innocence, and internal tension. In a strange twist, he was constantly writing the script of his own life without realizing it. Rob was political, passionate, and progressive. A devout liberal, he used his platform to speak out on social justice, same-sex marriage, and mental health. He funded documentaries, attended marches, challenged presidents. And alongside him was Michelle. Less visible, but no less influential. She was his center, his mirror, his fiercest protector. The family mantra was compassion, activism, openness. But inside their sprawling home, just past the pristine kitchen and sun-drenched library, was a guest house. And in that guest house lived a different story entirely. Nick's story, the part they didn't put in interviews, the part they tried to fix. Again and again, and again. Let's rewind. Nick Reiner was born into luxury. He had everything. Except peace. From an early age, teachers reported behavioral issues, sudden outbursts, paranoia, refusal to follow structure. The Reiners tried tutors, therapists, camp. By 14, Nick was experimenting with hard drugs. By 15, he was institutionalized. The public didn't know, but Jake did. Jake watched it all. And while the family tried to protect Nick, cover for him, give him one more chance, Jake grew quieter, more distant, more alert. And then came the film. In 2015, Rob and Nick co-wrote Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film about a young addict who lashes out against his father, a famous public figure. It was Nick's story. It was also a warning. Audiences saw it as brave, candid, a father-son bonding exercise in artistic healing. But those close to the family say Jake was disturbed because the film wasn't fictionalized enough. It was too real, too raw, and Nick didn't look like someone healing. He looked like someone rehearsing. Let that sink in. A son, acting out his rage on screen, with the help of the very man he blamed for his misery. And yet Rob seemed proud. He talked about breaking the stigma, family redemption, making art from pain. But pain, as it turns out, isn't so easily contained in a script. And not all stories end in resolution. Some end in blood. Meanwhile, Jake kept his distance. He pursued journalism. First sports, then hard news. He reported facts, not feelings. He didn't do many interviews, but friends said he was sharp, detail-oriented, a bit of a perfectionist. Not cold, just cautious. He loved his parents. He respected their fame, but he never wanted it for himself. And he was increasingly concerned about what it was doing to Nick. Now picture this, Sunday dinners. Rob at the head of the table, Michelle pouring wine, Romy talking about her acting class, Jake sharing a dry joke about a story he'd chased all week. Then Nick. Late, sunglasses indoors, shaking, talking a mile a minute about a producer who screwed him or a neighbor who spied on him. Sometimes he'd cry. Other times he'd rage. At least once, a glass was thrown. Jake would leave early. Every time. You see, to understand the collapse of the Reiner household, you need to understand how they managed it. They didn't scream. They smoothed. They didn't confront. They comforted. And in doing so, they created a vacuum. A space where danger could grow unchecked, behind velvet drapes and award-winning screenplays. Let's go deeper. By 2022, Nick was back in the guest house. He was 29, recently out of rehab, again. Friends say he was manic, talking about spiritual warfare, saying they were watching. He kept journals, some over 200 pages long, filled with messy handwriting and phrases like, "He's always watching me. I don't need to be silenced anymore. Dad gave everything to Jake. I'm not a side character." These weren't just cries for help. They were warning signs. But were they seen? Or ignored? Family insiders say there was a divide. Jake wanted boundaries. Michelle wanted forgiveness. Rob wanted peace. And Nick? Nick wanted power. Jake once reportedly told a close friend, "He's going to snap. And when he does, don't say I didn't tell you." Still, nothing changed. Nick was allowed to stay. Allowed to eat with them. Allowed to scream. Cry. Accuse. He called Jake the traitor. He called Romy the favorite. And in one chilling voicemail, later obtained by LAPD, he left Rob a message saying, "I'm not invisible anymore. You'll see." It was dismissed as an emotional episode. But episodes don't stab people. People do. In 2023, Jake moved into his own apartment on the other side of Los Angeles. He said he wanted space. But behind that calm facade was growing unease. He kept notes, printed screenshots, voice recordings, and, allegedly, a sealed folder marked with 3 words. For when it happens. What did he know? And why didn't Rob ask? Or maybe he did. Here's where it gets painful. According to a friend of Jake's from CBS, Rob and Jake had a heated phone call just 6 weeks before the murders. Jake told him, "You're going to regret this, and I won't be able to help you when it happens." Rob reportedly responded, "He's our son, Jake, not a monster." That sentence might haunt the Reiner legacy forever, because weeks later, Rob and Michelle would be found dead in their home. And Nick? He was there, not as a grieving son, but as the suspect. Let's pause. This isn't just about a dysfunctional family. This is about a legacy built on empathy, paralyzed by denial. This is about a son trying to warn his parents and being dismissed as too intense, too serious, too controlling. This is about boundaries ignored in the name of love. And it's about how sometimes love isn't enough. Because in the house of Reiner, everyone had a role. Rob, the hero. Michelle, the heart. Romy, the dreamer. Jake, the observer. Nick, the wounded. But eventually, the wounded, when left untreated, can become dangerous. And Jake knew that. He said it. He wrote it. He lived it. And then he died with it. Alone. But what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous thing in a family isn't anger, but silence? What if the brother who stayed quiet wasn't indifferent, but terrified? And what if the warning everyone dismissed wasn't emotional at all, but forensic? Because Jake Reiner wasn't guessing. He was observing. And that changes everything. Jake never raised his voice. That's the first thing people remember about him. No theatrics. No dramatic confrontations. No public meltdowns. He didn't argue to win. He asked questions to understand. He listened. He noticed what others overlooked. In a family where emotions ran hot, where Nick's storms sucked the oxygen out of every room, Jake learned to survive by becoming precise, methodical, careful. And as the years passed, careful turned into concerned. Concerned turned into alarm. And alarm turned into documentation. Let's start here. Jake Reiner was the eldest son, but he never played the big brother protector role in the traditional sense. He didn't wrestle Nick to the ground. He didn't lecture him. He didn't try to fix him. Instead, Jake did what journalists do. He collected evidence. Friends say Jake carried a small black notebook everywhere. Nothing flashy. No dramatic covers. Just pages filled with tight handwriting, dates, arrows, and underlined phrases. He didn't write feelings. He wrote patterns. When Nick relapsed. When Nick threatened. When Nick calmed down. When Nick blamed someone else. When Nick fixated on Rob. When Nick mentioned money. When Nick talked about being owed. Jake didn't panic. He tracked. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so unsettling. Jake loved his family deeply. He admired his father. He spoke highly of his mother. He was protective of Romy. But love didn't blind him. If anything, it sharpened his fear. Because when you love people, you notice when they're in danger. And Jake believed, quietly, persistently, that his parents were in danger. Around 2021, Jake began confiding in a very small circle. Not about Nick's addiction. That was old news. Not about the arguments. Those were constant. But about something else. A shift. A change in Nick's language. A tightening of his worldview. A sense that Nick wasn't just angry anymore. He was strategic. Jake allegedly told one friend, "He's not spiraling. He's focusing." That sentence matters. Because spirals are chaotic. Focus is deliberate. Jake noticed that Nick began talking less about recovery and more about entitlement. Not "I messed up," but "they ruined my life." Not "I need help," but "I deserve compensation." He talked about Rob's success as if it were stolen from him. As if Rob's career existed at Nick's expense. As if fame were an inheritance wrongfully withheld. Jake wrote it down. And then there were the questions. Nick started asking about the house. The locks. The cameras. The security system. At first, it sounded casual. "Dad, do we still have the old keypad or did you upgrade?" "Michelle, do the cameras store footage or overwrite?" Jake noticed. Why would Nick care? Why now? Jake's journalism background mattered here. He understood motive. Means. Opportunity. He wasn't accusing his brother of a crime. He was recognizing risk. And risk doesn't need certainty. It needs probability. There was an incident in late 2022 that changed Jake permanently. It wasn't public. It wasn't dramatic. But it terrified him. According to multiple sources, Jake overheard Nick on the phone, speaking to someone Jake didn't recognize. Nick was pacing the driveway, voice low, furious. And then he said something that made Jake stop walking. "Don't worry. They won't see it coming." Jake froze. He didn't confront him. He didn't text his parents immediately. He went home, and he wrote for 3 hours straight. From that night on, Jake's tone changed. He became more urgent. More direct. He stopped cushioning his concerns. He told Rob plainly, "You're underestimating him." Rob brushed it off. He always did. Not because Rob was careless, but because Rob was hopeful. Hope can be dangerous when it replaces action. Jake tried a different approach. He appealed to Michelle. He framed it as safety, boundaries, structure, rules. Michelle listened. She always listened. But listening didn't mean acting. She believed Nick needed compassion, not restriction. Jake believed compassion without limits was a gamble they couldn't afford. The family stalled. Time passed. The guest house remained occupied. And then Jake did something that, in hindsight, feels chilling. He began preparing contingencies. He backed up files. Multiple times. Different locations. He started labeling folders not by emotion, but by outcome. If this escalates. If something happens. Timeline. Friends say this wasn't paranoia. It was calm. Purposeful. As if Jake were building a case, without a courtroom. Now here's the part no one wants to talk about. Jake didn't just fear for his parents. He feared for himself. There were moments when Nick's rage turned toward him. Moments when Nick accused Jake of betrayal, of siding with Rob, of documenting him. Nick once sent Jake a text that read, "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Jake didn't reply, but he screenshotted it. Another message came weeks later. Short, chilling, careful. Jake archived it. Why didn't he go to the police? Why didn't he force an intervention? Ask yourself this. How do you report a crime that hasn't happened? How do you accuse your brother without proof? How do you convince your parents to see their son as a threat when they see him as wounded? Jake was trapped between love and logic, and logic was losing. People close to Jake say he struggled with guilt. Guilt for watching. Guilt for not stopping it. Guilt for feeling afraid of his own brother. But fear doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you alert. And Jake was alert to the very end. There's one conversation that haunts everyone who knew him. Jake spoke to a colleague just days before his death. He sounded exhausted, not panicked, resigned. He said, "I think I've done everything I can. If they don't listen now, they never will." When asked what he meant, he paused, then said, "Some people only understand consequences." That sentence was never meant to be prophetic, but it became exactly that. Jake died quietly. No spectacle, no public explanation, no press conference. And then, weeks later, his parents were murdered. Suddenly, everything Jake had said mattered. Every note, every warning, every dismissed concern. Ask yourself this. If Jake had lived, would the outcome have been different? Would he have pushed harder? Would he have gone public? Would he have forced a line the family refused to draw? Or was he already too late? Because here's the truth that no one can escape. Jake Reiner wasn't ignored because he was wrong. He was ignored because what he was saying was unbearable. Because accepting it meant admitting that love hadn't been enough. That success hadn't protected them. That compassion had crossed into negligence. And that their own son might be capable of something unthinkable. Jake saw it. He said it. He documented it. And then he died. And when the blood dried at the Brentwood estate, the question wasn't, how could this happen? It was, why didn't we listen to Jake? But what came next would turn Jake's quiet warnings into something far more disturbing. Because after his death, something was found among his belongings. Something he never meant to send. Something he labeled not with emotion, but with certainty. And the envelope it was sealed and carried a message no one could ignore. What would you do if someone handed you an envelope and told you to only open it if something terrible happens? Would you open it early? Would you laugh it off? Would you forget about it completely until blood stained the walls of your childhood home? Because that's exactly what happened with Jake Reiner. He didn't just warn people. He left proof. Written, sealed, hidden. A single envelope tucked away in the back of a bookshelf beneath an old dog-eared copy of Stand By Me. A movie directed by his father, Rob Reiner. A film about boys, death, truth, and the loss of innocence. Coincidence? Or one final message? Because what Jake wrote inside that envelope, it didn't just predict what was coming. It named names. And what came next sent shivers down the spine of everyone who read it. Let's rewind for a moment. After Jake's sudden death, quiet, unexplained, brushed aside by many as natural causes, his belongings were boxed and moved, mostly untouched. Until Romy visited his apartment to collect some personal mementos. A sweater, a photo album, a favorite vinyl. What she didn't expect was the envelope. It was beige, worn at the corners, untitled. But on the back, scrawled in Jake's tight handwriting, were 3 chilling words. If I'm not here. Not if I die. Not open in case of emergency. Just, if I'm not here. As if Jake knew he might vanish. As if he suspected that someone, maybe even someone close, might try to erase what he knew. Romy didn't open it immediately. She was grieving. Numb. She tossed it into her shoulder bag, assuming it was maybe a note, a bill, something Jake forgot to mail. But days later, as the coroner released Jake's personal effects and the family tried to process his quiet passing, Romy remembered the envelope. And that's when she opened it. And what she read changed the entire narrative. Because Jake wasn't just preparing for a possibility. He was documenting a forecast. A personal threat assessment. With names, dates, incidents, and one final plea. Let's break down what was inside. The envelope contained 5 pages, folded together. Each page written in blue ink, clean margins, deliberately constructed. Jake's journalism training was clear. This wasn't a suicide note. This wasn't the writing of a man in emotional collapse. This was investigative documentation. Organized. Labeled. It read more like a memo to the future. And the subject of that memo? Nick Reiner. The first page was titled, Pattern Recognition, Emotional Escalation and Behavioral Markers. Jake listed specific incidents over the last 18 months. October 11th, 2023, Nick punches hole in guest house drywall after fight with Rob. November 4th, 2023, screams about being cut out of the estate. December 1st, 2023, seen pacing driveway at 2 a.m., speaking to himself, holding wine bottle. Each incident was followed by Jake's observation. Increasing aggression toward family members, particularly male authority figures, likely triggered by discussions about finances, control, or lack of respect. These were clinical, detached, but filled with dread. This wasn't brotherly gossip. This was a forensic profile. The second page, even more chilling. Concerning statements made by N. Reiner, Jake listed direct quotes he had either heard himself or had been told about by Romy, Michelle, or others in the household. He thinks he's better than me because he has a job and I have trauma. One day they'll regret treating me like a mistake. Nobody will be laughing when I'm the only one left standing. Each quote followed by Jake's notes. Analysis. Triggers. Emotional state. Context. One line stood out. Most troubling statement to date. I've already written my version of events. Let the world decide who's the victim. A line that reads like a journal entry, or a manifesto, or a justification. Page 3. Risk zones and property. Jake mapped out weak spots in the Reiner family estate. Kitchen window left open nightly for airflow. Guest house has unrestricted access to main house via back patio. Security cameras outdated. Local storage only. No cloud backup. Panic button in Rob's office is decorative, not wired. You read that correctly. Jake wasn't guessing how something might happen. He was preparing for when it would. Then came page 4. A copy of an email. But not one Jake had sent. One he wrote, but never sent. To Rob. Subject line. Please read this before it's too late. The message wasn't angry. It wasn't blaming. It was calm, direct, scary in its precision. Jake wrote, Dad, this isn't about love. It's about safety. You want to believe in redemption. I respect that. But Nick is not in recovery. He's in rage. And rage, when uncontained, becomes strategy. I don't think you see how close this is to collapse. I'm begging you, update the cameras. Change the locks. Don't leave the guest house unmonitored at night. This isn't paranoia. It's probability. Please, before the story ends in blood. It was never sent. No drafts in Jake's email account. Just a printed copy. Filed. Labeled. Archived. And then, page 5. No title. Just a handwritten list. 3 names. All underlined. R.O.B. Michelle. Me. No explanation. No context. Just those names. As if Jake was identifying the targets. Or listing those he believed to be in danger. The implication was devastating. Was Jake predicting that he himself would be killed? Did he believe Nick might not only hurt their parents, but him too? Or did Jake see himself as a casualty of being ignored? A symbolic third victim? Either way, the list hit Romy like a punch to the chest. And then came the final line. At the bottom of the last page, in smaller writing. If I'm gone, this was my voice. Don't let it disappear. Let's pause. This isn't a twist in a movie. This is real. This is a man documenting the threat he believes exists inside his own family. Not because he hates his brother, but because he loves his parents. Because he believes something is coming. And because he knows, deep down, that no one is listening loud enough. After Romy read the letter, she collapsed onto Jake's apartment floor and cried. For hours. Not just because he was gone, but because he had seen it all coming. And she had missed the signs. Or maybe, refused to believe them. She called her therapist. Then she called her mother. No answer. Then her father. No answer. It was the night of December 13th. By sunrise the next day, both Rob and Michelle Reiner would be dead. Now, you're probably asking yourself, could this letter have saved them? Would reading it earlier have changed anything? Why didn't Jake show it to them face to face? Why didn't he go to the authorities? All fair questions. But remember this. Jake was raised in a family that preached unity. Privacy. Control. Going to the police wasn't just a legal step, it was a betrayal. Or at least, that's how it would have felt. So instead, Jake documented, prepared, hoped he was wrong, and died without ever knowing he was right. The envelope was eventually handed over to LAPD detectives. It is now listed as evidence. But its real power is emotional, because it reframes the entire story. No longer is this just a murder case involving a troubled son. It's a case involving a foreseen murder. And a silenced warning. One that could have stopped the bloodshed. One that now haunts everyone who ignored it. But the mystery doesn't end there. Because when investigators examined Jake's apartment further, they found something else. Not a letter, not a file, not a journal, but a USB drive, labeled with 3 words. Final recording, play only if. What's on that recording? What did Jake say? And why did he save it, instead of speaking it out loud? The envelope told part of the story. But the recording? That would blow everything wide open. What happens when the person you're trying to save becomes the very person you need to be saved from? What happens when he needs help turns into he needs to be stopped? Because that's the line the Reiner family didn't see in time. And by the time they did, it was already too late. The guest house. It was never meant to be permanent. It was a stepping stone, a safe space, a halfway point between chaos and stability. That's how Rob Reiner described it once during a family dinner, according to a longtime friend. But it didn't turn out that way. Instead, it became a breeding ground. For resentment. For obsession. For strategy. Nick Reiner didn't just live there. He brooded there. He planned there. He transformed from troubled son to silent threat. Nick had always lived in the long shadow of his father's fame. But unlike Jake, who retreated from it, quietly building a career in journalism, Nick clung to it. Wanted it. Needed it. And when he couldn't have it on his own terms, that desire turned into something darker. A feeling of being owed. A belief that success had been stolen from him. Not by Hollywood, but by his own family. From the outside, Nick was charming. Funny even. He could hold a conversation. He could quote film scripts, laugh at jokes, talk politics. He was creative. That's what made it so confusing. That's what made it so dangerous. Because inside that charm was a storm. Let's go back. Nick Reiner was born into privilege, but not peace. As a teen, he spiraled fast. By 15, he was in treatment centers. By 16, he'd overdosed twice. By 17, he was nearly homeless, until his parents staged their first intervention. It wouldn't be the last. Addiction is cruel. It doesn't care about legacy. It doesn't care about love. And it doesn't end with a single breakthrough. Nick cycled through over a dozen programs. Some state-run, some elite, some spiritual, some experimental. Each time, he came out with promises, tears, and then, inevitably, rage. You see, Nick wasn't just battling substances. He was battling identity. To him, the Reiner name wasn't a blessing. It was a curse, a constant comparison, a standard he could never meet. He once told a counselor, being Rob Reiner's son means you're always in second place, even in your own home. That bitterness festered, and it took root in the guest house. By 2015, things appeared to shift. Nick co-wrote Being Charlie, a raw, unfiltered look at a young man's battle with addiction. He starred alongside a fictionalized version of his own father. The press applauded it. The family hoped it marked a turning point. But to some insiders, it felt like something else. Not therapy, but rehearsal. A dangerous reenactment of trauma disguised as art. And Nick was still not okay. Post-film, the downward spiral returned. Nick accused his parents of exploiting his pain. He felt the movie hadn't healed him. It had exposed him. He began using again. Disappeared for weeks at a time. Returned disheveled. angry, erratic, and always back to the guest house. By late 2023, Nick was 32, and he was spiraling again. Only this time, it felt different. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flailing. He was quiet, controlled. Neighbors reported seeing him walking alone in the yard at 3 a.m., talking to himself, carrying a notebook. One neighbor, an elderly woman, says she once heard him shouting, "They're going to regret what they did to me." She thought it was a movie rehearsal. It wasn't. Inside the guest house, Nick's world had shrunk. He had no job, no consistent income, no romantic partner. But he had time, hours upon hours to think, plot, ruminate. He wrote constantly, page after page of journal entries, never shared, never published. Authorities would later recover these journals. They were disturbing, filled with imagery of betrayal, fire, punishment, and justice. One page simply read, "They'll scream, they'll beg, I'll be heard." And on another, "Jake watches me. I watch him too." Let that sink in. Nick had begun to view his family as a jury, one that had already convicted him, and he was preparing an appeal, not in court, but in violence. According to LAPD's preliminary timeline, Nick's activity spiked in the final weeks before the murders. He stopped taking calls from his therapist. He deleted several voicemails. He purchased a new hunting knife from an outdoor gear store in Hollywood. Receipts confirmed. Camera footage confirmed. But perhaps most chilling, Nick began drawing floor plans, detailed sketches of the main house, labeled, marked. He circled doorways, wrote notes like, "Always unlocked after 10 p.m. Mom's reading room, dark until 1 a.m. Rob's study equals vulnerable." These weren't the writings of someone lost in psychosis. They were cold, calculated, premeditated. Jake had seen it, and he tried to warn them. But the Reiners were a family rooted in belief. They believed Nick was still reachable, still salvageable, still just struggling. They believed love was enough. It wasn't. There was one final straw, a fight between Nick and Rob. Heated, explosive. Nick accused Rob of altering the family trust, claimed he was being cut out of the future. Rob, according to a friend, told him, "Nick, it's not about punishment. It's about protecting the people you're hurting." Nick didn't respond. He walked out, straight to the guest house, and locked the door. After the murders, police searched that guest house. What they found was shocking. Not just knives, not just journals, but scripts. Yes, scripts. Drafts of scenes, dialogues, monologues, fictionalized, but unmistakably about his family. One scene featured a character named Robert. Another, the betrayer. In one line, the character yells, "This house was never yours. It was built on my blood." Art. Or confession. There was more. Photos taped to the wall. Surveillance maps. Printouts of emails. Jake's emails, with handwritten annotations. One said, "He knows." Another, "Not if I move first." When questioned, Nick didn't deny the items were his. He simply smiled and said, "It's all part of the show." That smile would vanish when detectives told him both his parents were dead. He said nothing, not a single word. Nick Reiner is now charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He has pleaded not guilty. His defense? Still unclear. Insanity? Self-defense? A narrative of victimhood? Only time will tell. But the facts are stacking up. And the journals, the floor plans, the scripts, the knives, the envelope from Jake, they all tell one chilling story. A story not of an accident, but of an eruption, planned, executed, and written long before the blood spilled. The Reiners wanted to believe they could save their son. Instead, they invited the storm inside their home. And Jake, he knew the storm was coming. He just didn't know he'd be swallowed up by it too. But if the guest house held darkness, the main house would soon reveal a clue no one expected. Something hidden, overlooked, deliberately buried. A single journal page, with a sentence that would rewrite everything. There's something deeply unnerving about watching tragedy unfold, second by second. When it's not fiction, when there's no score, no narrator, no reset button, just raw, pixelated horror, captured forever. Because the night Rob and Michelle Reiner were murdered inside their Brentwood estate wasn't entirely lost to darkness. It was partially recorded, partially witnessed, and partially, disturbingly, anticipated. But what the footage didn't show was just as terrifying as what it did. Because sometimes, The most chilling detail is what's missing. Or worse, what's erased. The Brentwood estate was equipped with security cameras, not because they feared the outside world, but because, like any high-profile family, they understood visibility was protection. But here's the catch. The Reiner system was outdated. Set up years ago, never upgraded. Local storage only, meaning no cloud backup, no live feed. Just hard drives sitting quietly in a cabinet in Rob's study, recording over themselves every 72 hours. Unless something went wrong. Something that forced someone to pull the plug. And that's exactly what someone did. But not before a few critical fragments were saved. Let's walk through the timeline. December 14th, 2025, 2:11 a.m. A motion sensor triggers the backyard camera. A figure enters the frame. No facial recognition. No audio. But the outline is unmistakable. Loose hoodie. Thin frame. Limp on the left side. Consistent with surveillance photos of Nick Reiner taken just a week earlier at a nearby liquor store. The figure walks slowly toward the back patio door. Then stops. Turns. Looks directly into the camera. And smiles. That smile sent chills through the spine of every LAPD officer who reviewed the tape. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't crazed. It was calm. Controlled. Like someone performing. 2:12 a.m. The figure lifts something toward the side of the house. Investigators believe it was a wire cutter. Seconds later, the camera feed freezes. Not cuts to black. Freezes. As if someone deliberately disabled the connection mid-frame. The next motion alert doesn't come for 6 hours. By then, Rob and Michelle Reiner are already dead. What happened in that missing window? That blacked-out vacuum of time? That's the million-dollar question. Because by 8:22 a.m., Romy Reiner would walk into the main house and find her father's body in the hallway. Her scream, caught on a neighbor's doorbell cam, is now considered the unofficial timestamp of discovery. But the footage stops before the violence begins. It's like a movie that ends just before the climax. Except this time, the climax was real and irreversible. Now let's get specific. The hard drive from the camera system was partially intact. Investigators recovered a few broken files, glitchy, pixelated frames that showed movement in the dining room at 2:16 a.m. A chair knocked over. A flash of movement. Then, static. Whatever happened between 2:12 and 2:18 a.m. was lost to a data corruption so precise, so contained, that some experts believe it was intentional. Erasure, not failure. But here's where it gets eerie. Across the estate, inside the guest house, was a second system, unknown to Rob and Michelle, installed by Nick, used to monitor his stuff, according to his earlier statement. But what was really being monitored? When detectives accessed the guest house DVR, they expected to find personal footage. Bedroom, studio, hallway. What they found instead was cross footage. Angles aimed not at the guest house, but at the main house. One camera specifically focused on the back door. One lens trained on the kitchen window. Another fixed on the upstairs hallway window, where Rob often worked late into the night. Nick was watching them, not for security, for timing, for routine, for opportunity. That changes everything. It means the attack wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was tactical, planned with precision, executed with surveillance. A son watching his parents in silence for months. Waiting, studying, until the night he walked out of the shadows and into their home. The LAPD also discovered something else on that guest house DVR. Deleted footage. But not completely. Tech specialists retrieved fragments, moments Nick had recorded and tried to erase. One frame showed Nick holding a large kitchen knife. In another, he's pacing his room, shirtless, whispering. The audio's distorted, but one sentence was deciphered. They won't see it coming. I promise. A chilling echo of Jake's warning. Because remember, Jake documented a quote from Nick that read, "They won't see it coming." Now the same phrase appears on recovered footage. Different medium. Same threat. Confirmed. This wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. And patterns, in criminal psychology, often point to intent. Investigators also matched the shoes visible in the backyard frame to a pair found in Nick's guest house closet. Same sole pattern. Same size. Traces of dirt consistent with the landscaping outside the Reiner kitchen door. That evidence became part of the arrest warrant. Combined with the timeline, the motive, the prior threats. Nick's silence in custody only made the case stronger. He refused to comment on the footage, refused to confirm or deny the man in the video was him. But silence, in this case, spoke volumes. Now here's where things take a turn. One detective, who spoke anonymously, shared that upon reviewing the final frozen frame of the backyard footage, he noticed something unusual. In the window behind the figure's silhouette, a light flickers. It's faint, barely visible, but it's there. Investigators believe that's the moment Rob opened the hallway door, possibly to check on a noise. It's believed to be the last moment he was alive. One frame later, the camera goes dark. One moment later, the world loses Rob Reiner, director, father, husband, icon, and it's all captured in the grainy static of a camera he never upgraded. A camera Jake told him, in writing, to replace. And now it's part of a murder file, a digital ghost of what could have been prevented. There's something sickening about watching evil unfold, not in a dramatic burst, but in slow, deliberate, almost casual motion. Because that's what the footage shows. No panic, no frenzy, just a man, likely Nick, approaching a house as if he belonged there. Because he did. And that's what makes this so horrifying. He wasn't a stranger. He was family. And family, when broken, is the most dangerous weapon of all. But here's what no one expected. While police pored over the footage, while Romy struggled to sleep, while Jake's envelope gained traction on social media, a cleaning crew entered the main house to sanitize and recover any salvageable belongings. And in Rob's study, beneath the rug, under the floorboard, something was found. Something handwritten, something folded, something torn from a journal. One page, one paragraph, one sentence that no one saw coming. It would raise more questions than answers, because it wasn't written before the murders. It was dated 3 days prior, and it contained a line that changed everything. If Jake's right, then we're sitting on a bomb. What if the final warning wasn't from Jake, but from Rob himself? What if, in the last moments before everything fell apart, Rob Reiner, beloved filmmaker, father, husband, finally saw what his son had been trying to say? And what if he wrote it down? Just one sentence. But that sentence now hangs over everything. Because it doesn't just confirm Jake's fears. It confirms that Rob Reiner knew something wasn't right. Knew the air inside his own home had turned heavy with danger. And he buried that truth, literally. Until now. The house had been swept, evidence tagged, rooms sealed, bodies removed. But as the investigation unfolded, the Reiner family's estate needed to be professionally cleaned. It was a formality. Blood cleanup, biohazard protocols, storage boxes labeled with care. And then, on the third day after the murders, a specialist stepped into Rob's study. He pulled back a rug to assess for deep cleaning, and noticed one floorboard was loose. Not broken, not warped, just shifted, barely enough to notice, but enough to open. And beneath it, folded into a tight square, brown slightly at the edges, was a piece of paper. Lined, torn, handwritten, signed with a single letter, R. The LAPD was notified immediately. They took the page into evidence. And what it contained sent a chill through the entire case team. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't a journal entry in the usual sense. It was a reflection, written with tension, unease, and perhaps regret. It read, "Michelle still thinks I'm overreacting. But Jake isn't wrong. I keep hearing the way Nick talks. The rage in his voice. It's not just pain. It's something else. Something harder. Something that's been brewing. If Jake's right, then we're sitting on a bomb." That final line, "We're sitting on a bomb." Not metaphorical, not poetic, but specific, final, terrifying. Let's break this down. Rob wasn't guessing anymore. He was acknowledging. He was beginning to believe. After months, maybe years, of brushing off Jake's warnings, it appears Rob had finally started to feel it himself. The shift in the air, the tension in Nick's movements, the darkness rising in the guest house. And instead of speaking it out loud, he wrote it down and hid it. Why hide it? That's the question investigators kept coming back to. Was it shame? Was it denial? Was it fear that saying it out loud would make it real? Or did Rob think, somewhere deep down, that admitting it meant giving up on Nick completely? Because here's the cruel irony. Rob Reiner spent decades fighting for justice, speaking out against violence, championing mental health. And yet, In his final days, he couldn't protect his own family from the very danger he'd warned others about, because that danger was his son. The handwriting was confirmed as Rob's by multiple analysts. The ink matched a pen found on his desk, and the date, December 11th, was just 3 days before the murders. 3 days, which means Rob was still alive, still thinking, still processing, but something stopped him from acting. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe it was too late. There's one more detail. Beneath the paragraph, scrawled hastily, almost as an afterthought, was a single phrase. We need a plan. No plan was found. No follow-up note. No text messages sent. Just that sentence, trapped in time. As if Rob had finally decided to listen to Jake. And then, everything exploded, just like Jake said it would. Let's talk about that sentence again. We're sitting on a bomb. It wasn't abstract. It was observational. It meant Rob felt it too. The volatility, the energy shifting. He may not have believed Nick would go that far, but he believed something was coming. An eruption, a confrontation, something that would shatter what was left of their fragile peace. And that means Jake's warnings weren't ignored out of arrogance. They were ignored out of hope. Hope that things could still be fixed. Hope that love could still win. Hope that family meant safety. But in this case, family was the fuse. After the note was discovered, Romy reportedly collapsed. Again, she had just begun to process Jake's envelope. Now her father's secret fears were surfacing too. It was as if every voice she trusted had been whispering warnings in private. But no one had said them out loud. Not until it was too late. The journal page became a turning point in the investigation, not because it contained new forensic evidence, but because it shifted the narrative. This was no longer a sudden tragedy. This was a slow-motion disaster. Everyone saw it coming. Everyone felt it. But no one could stop it, because stopping it meant facing the unthinkable. That Nick Reiner, son of Rob, brother of Jake, resident of the guest house, was capable. And capable is a terrifying word, because it lives in the shadows between trust and terror, between what we hope is true and what we fear is. Jake was the first to say it. Rob was the last to admit it. And now, both of them are gone. One silenced by mystery, the other by murder. And the man they warned about? Still silent. Still on trial. Still facing the consequences of a crime too calculated to ignore. But there's one final twist to the journal page. One line. Scribbled lightly in the margin. It wasn't dated. It wasn't signed. Just 7 words. Check the drawer. It's all there. What drawer? What was all there? Police tore the study apart. They searched desks, cabinets, filing boxes. Nothing. Until they found a locked drawer in Michelle's bedroom vanity. Inside, a small collection of Jake's notes. Pages Rob had requested, weeks before his death. Jake had sent them in secret. Copies of his warnings. His theories. His timeline. Rob was reading them. He was building something. And now, that plan, whatever it was, is lost forever. Or is it? Because one of the notes had a name circled in red. A name no one expected. A name not yet mentioned in this case. A name now under investigation by the LAPD. A name that might reveal Nick didn't act alone. A name that could turn this murder case into something even darker. And more shocking. What happens when the person on the sidelines knows more than they're saying? When someone outside the immediate spotlight is carrying the heaviest truth. Because Tracy Reiner wasn't just a niece. She was family. She was blood. And in the days following the brutal murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, her uncle and aunt, Tracy's silence was deafening. Until it wasn't. Until she stood in court and whispered something so shocking, so raw, that it silenced the entire room. I told them not to let him back in. And then she collapsed. To understand the weight of that moment, we need to understand who Tracy Reiner really is. Most know her as an actress. She starred in A League of Their Own, When Harry Met Sally, Apollo 13. But what many forget, or never knew, is that Tracy is the daughter of Penny Marshall, which makes her, by family, Rob Reiner's step-niece. But emotionally, she was a Reiner, raised with them, a fixture at family dinners, close to Romy, protective of Jake, and, for a time, deeply involved in helping Nick. Tracy had seen the storm before anyone else believed it was coming, and when it came, she broke. It started weeks before the murders. A phone call, not between Rob and Tracy, but between Tracy and Jake. That's right, Jake had reached out to her. Why? Because he trusted her. Because she was one of the few people who didn't dismiss him as too careful or too cold. Jake told her everything. His notes. His envelope. The quote from Nick, "They won't see it coming." Tracy listened. And she didn't just believe him. She knew he was right. You see, Tracy had her own history with Nick. Years earlier, during one of his failed recovery attempts, he'd stayed with her for 3 nights. She thought it would help. A fresh space. A change of energy. Instead, she said it was the most unsettling experience of my life. Nick reportedly stayed up all night. Paced. Talked to himself. Wrote frantically in a notebook he wouldn't let anyone touch. On the final night, she found him staring into the backyard. She asked if he was okay. He said, "This house reminds me of what was taken from me." She asked what he meant. He said nothing. But that look? It stayed with her. For years. So when Jake came to her with concerns, she didn't hesitate. She tried to intervene. She begged Rob and Michelle to take precautions. She told them Jake was right. And she told them something else. That she believed Nick was fantasizing about violence. Rob thanked her. Michelle hugged her. But neither acted. At least not enough. Not soon enough. After the murders, Tracy vanished from public view. No interviews. No statements. No appearances. Until the arraignment. When Nick was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs. Expression blank. Shoulders hunched. No emotion. Tracy sat behind Romy. Eyes bloodshot. Hands shaking. And when Nick turned to glance at the gallery, Tracy didn't flinch. She stood up. Took 2 steps forward. And whispered, "It should have been me. I should have said more. I should have stopped you." Then she fell to the floor. Court was adjourned immediately. Reporters tried to follow. But Tracy was escorted out a back exit, weeping uncontrollably. Later that week, she was interviewed privately by detectives. That interview has never been made public. But sources say she handed over something incredible. A recording, audio, a voicemail, from Nick, dated 2 weeks before the murders. In it, Nick says, "You think you're so righteous. You think you're above all of this. But you're not. You're just another one who gets to live in the mansion while I rot. But not for long. Things are going to reset. You'll see." Let that sink in. Nick called Tracy and warned her. Not directly, not with specifics, but with intention, tone, threat. Tracy didn't delete it. She didn't ignore it. She saved it. She sent it to Jake. Jake replied with 2 words. "He's planning." That's when Tracy begged Rob again. But the cycle repeated. Excuses, compassion, delay, then death. In an open letter released weeks later, Tracy wrote, "There is no forgiveness in this moment. There is only grief, and fear, and guilt. I wish I had screamed louder. I wish I had dragged him out of that guest house myself. I wish I had burned it to the ground." That line, "burned it to the ground," wasn't metaphor. It was rage. Rage born of powerlessness. Because Tracy didn't just lose her family. She lost her faith in the system that told her to wait. That told her he's getting help. That told her he's still our son. But the story doesn't end with Tracy's breakdown. Because Tracy revealed something else to police. Something she saw in Nick's notebook the night he stayed at her home. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now it felt like prophecy. A sketch. Rough. Scribbled. A floor plan. Of a house. Not hers. Not Nick's apartment. But the Reiner family estate. Drawn in chilling detail. Windows marked. Doors labeled. With red X's. One X was by the back door. Another in the kitchen. Another in the upstairs hallway, near Rob's study. Tracy had forgotten about it. But after Jake's death, after Rob and Michelle were found, she remembered. And she told investigators exactly where to look. That sketch has now been entered into evidence. Prosecutors believe it proves premeditation. That Nick had been planning this for months. Watching. Studying. Documenting. And Tracy? She's now a key witness. Not just to the character of the accused, but to the growing possibility that he didn't plan it alone. That's right. Tracy didn't just see a plan. She heard a name. One Nick mentioned in passing. A name connected to Jake's notes. A name that appeared in Rob's final journal page. Circled. Twice. Someone close. Someone trusted. Someone who might have helped, intentionally or not. And that name? That's what we'll uncover next. Because Nick Reiner may have held the knife, but he might not have been the only one with blood on his hands. What if the most dangerous thing in a family isn't anger, but silence? What if the brother who stayed quiet wasn't indifferent, but terrified? And what if the warning everyone dismissed wasn't emotional at all, but forensic? Because Jake Reiner wasn't guessing. He was observing. And that changes everything. Jake never raised his voice. That's the first thing people remember about him. No theatrics. No dramatic confrontations. No public meltdowns. He didn't argue to win. He asked questions to understand. He listened. He noticed what others overlooked. In a family where emotions ran hot, where Nick's storms sucked the oxygen out of every room, Jake learned to survive by becoming precise, methodical, careful. And as the years passed, careful turned into concerned. Concerned turned into alarm. And alarm turned into documentation. Let's start here. Jake Reiner was the eldest son, but he never played the big brother protector role in the traditional sense. He didn't wrestle Nick to the ground. He didn't lecture him. He didn't try to fix him. Instead, Jake did what journalists do. He collected evidence. Friends say Jake carried a small black notebook everywhere. Nothing flashy. No dramatic covers. Just pages filled with tight handwriting, dates, arrows, and underlined phrases. He didn't write feelings. He wrote patterns. When Nick relapsed. When Nick threatened. When Nick calmed down. When Nick blamed someone else. When Nick fixated on Rob. When Nick mentioned money. When Nick talked about being owed. Jake didn't panic. He tracked. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so unsettling. Jake loved his family deeply. He admired his father. He spoke highly of his mother. He was protective of Romy. But love didn't blind him. If anything, it sharpened his fear. Because when you love people, you notice when they're in danger. And Jake believed, quietly, persistently, that his parents were in danger. Around 2021, Jake began confiding in a very small circle. Not about Nick's addiction. That was old news. Not about the arguments. Those were constant. But about something else. A shift. A change in Nick's language. A tightening of his worldview. A sense that Nick wasn't just angry anymore. He was strategic. Jake allegedly told one friend, "He's not spiraling. He's focusing." That sentence matters. Because spirals are chaotic. Focus is deliberate. Jake noticed that Nick began talking less about recovery and more about entitlement. Not "I messed up," but "they ruined my life." Not "I need help," but "I deserve compensation." He talked about Rob's success as if it were stolen from him. As if Rob's career existed at Nick's expense. As if fame were an inheritance wrongfully withheld. Jake wrote it down. And then there were the questions. Nick started asking about the house. The locks. The cameras. The security system. At first, it sounded casual. "Dad, do we still have the old keypad or did you upgrade?" "Michelle, do the cameras store footage or overwrite?" Jake noticed. Why would Nick care? Why now? Jake's journalism